Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. All year this year, the majority has tried to ram through legislation to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it with proposals that, in effect, cut health care for millions of people to finance tax cuts for those who make millions of dollars in income. All year, the American people have made it perfectly clear that this was the opposite of what they wanted. And fortunately, those repeal efforts failed. Now, instead of listening to the American people and learning from that failure, the majority has doubled down on its tax plan. Like health care, they've made no attempt to bring both sides together. In the Senate, we only saw the bill last Thursday, Mr. President. I'm on the Finance Committee. I've been on there for years. We didn't see, it wasn't even legislative language on Thursday. I remember back in the health care debate 9 years ago when people were saying, read the bill, read the bill. We came to the markup yesterday to offer amendments. There still wasn't a bill. There was not a bill. Thomas Jefferson used to say that he hoped, it didn't happen, he hoped that when these legislatures were put together in the United States Congress, that you would have to introduce a bill and then it would take 365 days before it could be enacted into legislation. And maybe that's where the Tea Party got the idea in 2009. Where are they now? Where are they now? We have not had a single hearing on this bill, Mr. President. And now they are marking up the most consequential tax policy in 31 years. One affecting every single American and moving around trillions of dollars in this economy. Remember back during the health care debate when it was 16% of our economy? And people were saying, read the bill. You better read this bill. There is not a school board in Colorado that would accept this process. There is not a city council that would accept this process. We have more process for a small decision about where parking meters should go than we have had in this process. And people are upset for good reason. When you rush big things, when you don't listen to different views, you get bad policy. I've heard the majority leader say that on this floor. And there's a reason why they're trying to rush it through. There's a reason why they don't want America to have a chance to read the bill or their representatives to this chamber read the bill. And that's because just like the health care proposals that they've made, the majority's tax plan is fundamentally flawed. Over the course of the campaign, President Trump, then candidate Trump, promised the American people, quote, no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, unquote. That's not fake news. That's what he said. He said, quote, everybody's got to be covered. Speaking of health insurance, Mr. President, everybody's got to be covered, he said. Everybody's going to be taken care of much better than they're taken care of now, end quote. He promised the public, quote, you're going to end up with great health care for a fraction of the price. That's what he told the American people. And yesterday, after a year after the election, after 8 years of saying repeal and replace, repeal and replace, repeal and replace, it turned out because there was no idea of how to replace it, there was no consensus on the Republican side about how to replace it, they failed twice to do it until yesterday. They added changes to a tax bill, literally in the middle of the night. Literally in the middle of the night, that would cause 13 million people, according to the Congressional Budget Office, to lose health insurance. increase premiums by up to 10%, according to the Congressional Budget Office, on the individual market each year, Mr. President, and lead, you can't make it up, to a $25 billion cut in Medicare. That's why what's happening here while people are distracted by what's going on in a Senate race in Alabama. How does this proposal in any way square with the president's promises during the campaign? All year, we saw tax cuts masquerading as a health care plan. And I went home to Colorado and people said, Michael, you work with people in a bipartisan way all the time. Why aren't you working on this health care bill? And what I said was, there is no one in Colorado who said to me, no one, including the critics of the Affordable Care Act, who said to me, Michael, I've got a good idea for helping me with my health care. Give the wealthiest people in America a tax cut. No one. Nobody came and said, let's cut Medicaid by 40% when we're facing the opioid crisis that we're facing. So they masqueraded it as a health care plan. And now we've got a health care plan masquerading as a tax plan. On top of that, this plan doubles down on the claim that tax cuts for the wealthiest people in America and businesses not only trickle down to everyone else, but also pay for themselves. And that part is not surprising because that has been the Republican answer for what ails our economy. When our economy was up and our deficit was down, they cut taxes for the top 1% of Americans, making an average of $2 million. When our economy was down and our deficit was up, they cut taxes on the top 1%, making an average of $2 million. And now they're embracing exactly the same game plan in their tax bill, in their tax plan. The Senate bill overwhelmingly benefits people and businesses who have done extremely well in this economy. And as a former business person myself, I have nothing against that success. In fact, I embrace that success. My issue is that trickle-down economics as a theory for economic growth has been entirely discredited by our own experiences. This is not a theoretical exercise anymore. It's not as if these arguments haven't been made time and time again and then been proven to be false, which leads me to wonder why this plan, or at least the version we debated yesterday, not as sure about it today, gives roughly $50,000 in tax cuts to those making over $1 million. For Americans earning under $200,000, which is 19 million households, they'd actually see a tax increase. Another 54 million households would see virtually no benefit at all. I agree that America needs tax reform. It's not about this Congress needing tax reform. It's not about a political imperative for doing tax reform. America needs tax reform. That's why I joined the Finance Committee to begin with. And tax reform means we should clean up special interest carve-outs. We should take steps. Just on that point, I just have to stop for a minute, Mr. President, and pause. On that point, for years, as part of the Gang of Eight, as Bull Simpson came through and was crushed, as there have been bipartisan discussions, always what people said was, on the corporate side, what we're going to do is lower the rate and broaden the base. That was the plan. And the way we were going to do that was by getting rid of a whole bunch of special interest loopholes. What this bill does is lower the rate, but it forgets about the second part of the equation. Because if you look at the broadening of the base, you actually have to take away someone's loophole. And that's hard to do. So instead what they're doing is lowering the rate and leaving the loopholes where they are. What a disaster. 31 years to get tax reform in this chamber, and that's the answer? Today, if you don't like a situation where we have the highest published corporate rate in the world, which I don't like, that's uncompetitive for the United States, 35%. But one of the things we know about it is that because of all those loopholes, no one actually very few people pay the 35%. Some do, and that's very unfair, because the average effective rate is more like 23%, not 35%, Mr. President. And that's because companies can use loopholes, they can move money overseas. If you're a newspaper company or you're a trucking company here, you can't do that stuff. And that's why you pay the 35%. And that is not fair. But this bill does nothing to take on those challenges. Nothing. We need tax reform to get rid of those special interest carve-outs. We should take steps to help our businesses compete, to unlock our energy economy, to modernize the electric grid. We need comprehensive and bipartisan reform. This cannot be done. I want to give Republicans the chance to blame Democrats for things they don't like, and Democrats to do the same, so we can actually get a result that's real reform, not something crammed through with 51 votes and a health care bill on top of it. It has been a terrible thing to see this Senate slide into the place that it is today. Mr. President, I know enough about you to know you're not satisfied with the fact that we've been running this government on 30 continuing resolutions for the last 10 years, that we can't pass a proper budget, we don't have an appropriations process anymore in the United States Senate. It's disgraceful. We would not accept it for any other institution of government or business on the planet. We certainly wouldn't accept it in Colorado. If when I was superintendent of schools, I went to tell people, well, we've got a little bit of a disagreement, so I'm going to shut the government down until we can deal with this continuing resolution, they would throw me out. They would throw me out. But that's what we've been doing here for the last 10 years, and now we have sunk to a new low. There has been no attempt to bring the parties together on this, none. And the result is a deeply flawed proposal, completely at odds with what our economy needs. If you accept the logic of the Republican plan, the problem with our economy is that the wealthiest institutions and individuals in the United States don't have enough money to invest and create high-paying jobs for everyone else. Sometimes I hear people at home say, I don't have anything against rich people. Neither do I. Neither do I. But the logic that somehow if you give somebody at the top a tax cut, that's going to result in an increase to other people's income is completely contradicted by the facts. Here's what's happened in America since 1987, for the last 30 years. This is median family income, Mr. President. This is the middle class in America, which basically for 40 years hasn't had a pay raise, has not had a pay raise. Okay, this can't be blamed on some socialist named Barack Obama. This is 40 years of American economic history, no pay raise. Over that period of time, here's what's happened to corporate profits. And if the logic were true, if the logic were correct or right, we would see the middle class income lifting better and doing better as corporate income statements and balance sheets hit all-time highs, which they have. This is the Great Recession. Here's where we are today. Here's where we were before the Great Recession, Mr. President. And here is median household income stubbornly flat. The balance sheets in this country are awash in cash. The biggest companies, awash in cash. It has not led them to help lift this line. And the result of this has been a huge widening of the income gap in America. If trickle-down economics really worked, Mr. President, every American would do better as incomes at the top rose. Instead, what has happened is the top 10%, which is roughly 11 million taxpayers, 11 million taxpayers out of a total in America, not of taxpayers, but of people, of 330 million people, 11 million taxpayers earning an average of $475,000 That top 10% now represents a larger share of America's wealth than everyone else. Than everyone else. Look at this. Here is the top 10%. These are the folks making, on average, $475,000. Obviously, many people in here make a lot more than that, but that's the average. They now earn more than the bottom 90% of earners in America. And that has not been the way this country has been. You have to go back to 1928, the year before the Great Depression, to see that level of income inequality in America. In between then and now, what we saw was a rising middle class, an economy that benefited everybody and lifted everyone up, gave them a chance to save and provide for their family. That's not happening anymore. The top 1% of earners are earning about 20% of the income. And it seems to me that the challenge with our economy is not that the folks at the very top don't have enough. They've got more than they've ever had. By a lot. By a lot. The top 10% have over 50% of the income in America. The bottom 90%, it seems crazy to say bottom 90%. It's not the bottom 10%. It's the rest of America. It's 90% of America earns less. And that's the challenge that we confront. The challenge is that incomes for everyone else haven't kept pace with the rising costs of housing or of health care or of higher education or child care. A month ago, I met a mom, I guess now it's several months ago, a mom in Rifle, Colorado at an early childhood center. That's on the west slope of Colorado. And she was so happy, and the other moms were so happy that they had this early childhood center because they had to drive 30 miles before to Glenwood Springs to have child care. And this mom said during the course of the conversation, she said to me, I have a job so I can have health insurance, and every single dollar that I make, every single dollar that I make goes to pay for this daycare center so I can have a job. And I have families all over my state that are stuck in that place, where at the end of every month they have to decide what they're going to go without. Can't afford housing, can't afford college, can't afford early childhood education, can't afford housing. That's increasingly becoming a huge issue. And there are too many Americans that are facing those unbelievably difficult choices. And for those of you that are here that might say, well, just tough it out, that's your issue, work harder. These folks are killing themselves. They are killing themselves. But they're having to make choices and decisions because our economy is not working well enough for everybody and not working at all for everybody. They're having to make choices their parents and grandparents never had to make. Erin Barnes is another one of my constituents. She lives in Thornton, Colorado with her husband and 2 kids. Both Erin and her husband have college degrees and middle-class jobs. Okay, so again, they are working. They are educated. Erin works in marketing and her husband runs an IT department. And earlier this month, she wrote to my office describing how, quote, they don't have luxury, describing how they, quote, don't have luxuries like cable television, haircuts, lattes, manicures, or even new clothes. My children all wear hand-me-downs from friends. And yet we make $1,200 less per month than we spend. It's not that we're irresponsible. Our monthly mortgage payment is only 25% of our income. How are the pieces not fitting together, she wrote. In America, as the president knows, consumer spending drives 70% of our economy. When costs rise and middle-class family wages stay flat, families like Erin's cut back foregoing books for their kids, birthday presents, health care, multiplied across millions of Americans, the 90% that we're talking about here, that has a dramatic effect on our economy because they're the folks that drive the 70% of our economy that's driven by consumer problems. That is the problem that we need to solve. That should be our focus. For their sake, but also to drive our economy. Not folks that have done the best in the economy and who are doing great. And I'm glad they're doing great. One way to help families like Aaron's is the American Family Act I wrote with Senator Sherrod Brown, which triples the child tax credit. Under our plan, Aaron's family would gain $3,000 per child, $300 per child each month. Not only does the Republican plan largely ignore families like Aaron's, it burdens her children with another $1.5 trillion in debt for the favor of doing nothing for them. Republicans claim, and you'll hear it over and over again, that their tax cuts pay for themselves. We heard that in the committee today. Anybody who has lived through what has happened since President Clinton was President of the United States knows that is false. And it was the logic that was used in 2001, the logic that was used in 2003, and it is what took us from having a $5 trillion projected surplus. You don't hear that word around here very often. A $5 trillion projected surplus when Bill Clinton finished being president to the record deficits that we have today. Let me make sure I've got the right chart up here, Mr. President. I do. In 1981, Ronald Reagan signed major tax cuts and claimed they would pay for themselves. By the end of his term, our national debt had risen 62%. In the 1990s, President Clinton raised taxes at the top and cut spending to balance the budget. With a Republican Congress, I was reminded today by Chairman Hatch, that one of the truly decent people in this place. And the economy boomed. And by 1999, the United States Senate, believe it or not, actually held hearings on what to do with a $5.6 trillion projected surplus. I'm not making this up. I know Democrats have a reputation for not caring about fiscal matters. Republicans have a reputation for taking it seriously. I don't know how that happened, but that's not the history. That is not the history. When George Bush was elected president, he passed 2 tax cuts, prosecuted 2 wars that were not paid for, and signed a $400 billion prescription drug benefit without paying for any of it. Medicare Part D didn't pay for $1 of it. The reason today we collect $1 for every $3 we spend in Medicare is largely because of what was done under President Bush. And when President Obama assumed office, from day one, he inherited a $1.2 trillion annual deficit and an economy in free fall. We were losing 800,000 jobs a month, and unemployment was climbing to 10%. And back then, and I was here, during the worst downturn since the Great Depression, Republican leaders here all of a sudden remembered their conservative fiscal discipline, just when the American people needed their help the most. Not when the economy was going well at the beginning of the Bush administration, not when we had a surplus, but when we had a $1.2 trillion deficit caused by the policies of the previous administration and a failure in the housing market. And it drove us into the worst recession since the Great Depression. And citing the debt that we had then, which Barack Obama had not put on the balance sheet of the United States government, every Republican opposed President Obama's economic recovery package to stabilize our economy. And now, not only that, they called it a Bolshevik takeover of the United States of America. And now, after inheriting a booming stock market and 4% unemployment, Republicans propose to add $1.5 trillion to our debt to finance, to give roughly $50,000 in tax cuts to those making over $1 million in this country. Again, sorry, Mr. President. Sorry. For this line. Today, America's debt is over $20 trillion. And we could face another economic downturn 4 months from now, or 6 months from now, or an armed conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The debt suffocates our ability to respond, just as it has suffocated our ability to deal with the opioid epidemic. When I got here, Mr. President, there was barely an opioid epidemic in America. And over the last decade, it has flooded our country. But if you live in a rural part of my state, if you live in the San Luis Valley in Colorado, your access to addiction treatment is the same as it was 10 years ago, because we're broke. Because we can't work in a bipartisan way to deal with these issues. It's disgraceful. Just as it was disgraceful to cut taxes in 2003, just after we sent our troops into Iraq. That was maybe the height of disgraceful. But when you know that there may be something imminent on the Korean Peninsula, when you know that the Middle East is in the turmoil that we're in, is this really the moment that we want to do this? I will say this on this floor: if my colleagues vote for this plan, they forfeit any right to claim that they are fiscal conservatives. And I am sad to say this, I really am. I think my colleague from Colorado would know I was telling the truth when I say I'm sad to say this. But I have learned over the past 9 years that the only time the majority seems to care about fiscal responsibility is when they are not actually responsible for it. In a sense, it is a devastatingly brilliant political strategy. You come to Washington arguing that government is incompetent. Then you explode the debt. Then you point to the debt as evidence of Washington's incompetence. And in 2016, here's how it all ends. In 2016, you elect a president who promised that he would eliminate our debt, quote, over a period of 8 years. That he would deliver, quote, a great, beautiful, massive tax cut. Pass, quote, one of the largest increases in defense spending in American history, while saying, quote, I'm not going to cut Social Security and I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid. Why not, he told the American people, since our national debt can be solved by, quote, eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, quote, ending redundant government programs, quote, growing the economy and renegotiating all of our deals. Here's the real problem, and I realize my colleagues are here. I'm going to take a few more minutes, if that's okay. Last year, 2/3 of the federal budget went to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and other mandatory spending. Of the remaining third, half goes to national defense. After interest on the debt, that leaves just 10% for all our investments in the future, in our future and our children's future, in infrastructure and research and innovation and education. Over the years, because of the insanity around this place, Washington has slashed that part of the budget, what's called domestic discretionary part of the budget, by 35% as a percentage of GDP. We've been really good at hacking on the stuff that's easy to get to. This should all seem deeply unfair to Americans in their 20s and younger, to know that we're investing simultaneously, investing less in them than our parents and grandparents invested in us, and then we have the nerve to say, you need to pay back the debt we accrued. We're not going to pay it back. We're not going to invest in you, and we're going to make you pay it back. We're going to live in the house, but you're going to be stuck with the mortgage. When I served as the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, we had to make hard choices to close schools, to modernize the curriculum, to fix unfunded pensions. We had intense fights. Like here, people had strong and principled disagreements. But unlike here, unlike in Washington, in Denver, the next generation was cause enough for us to set aside our differences and move forward. We understood that our children had no voice in our town halls. Their future had no votes at the school board meetings. They only had us to do it for them. We have forgotten that here in Washington, in these marbled halls and on this carpeted floor of the Senate and the House. We have abdicated our duty completely to the next generation. Instead, we impose on them all the hard questions we fail to answer in our time. Mr. President, we are burdening the future with our debts. We are burdening them with the hard choices that we avoid, with the easy path that we follow, with the baseless claims that we accept that tax cuts for folks that are doing great somehow trickle down and pay for themselves. That's false. If this plan passes, Washington will once again encroach on the rights of our children and our grandchildren to enjoy the same freedom and opportunity that our parents and grandparents handed us. What a shameful legacy that would be. What a surrender of our responsibility as Americans. Mr. President, we have to set aside this flawed proposal and this broken process and instead have an honest, bipartisan effort that contends forthrightly with the substantive challenges of our fiscal condition and the political difficulties attendant to solving them. I may be right, but I suspect what history will prove is that no meaningful solution can be found by one party alone. Mr. President, I thank my colleagues for their indulgence, especially my friend from Missouri who is here, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.